call to order the February 23rd, 2021 Ordinance Committee meeting. Ms. Crisante, if you would call roll.
Certainly. Councilmember Kristen Sneddon.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
Chair Jordan.
And here. Thanks. And then we'll entertain public comment of items that are not on today's agenda. And Ms. Crisante, if you'd just run through really quickly, orally, I guess, what's up there on the screen for anybody who wants to raise their hand and how they can do so.
Sure. To make a public comment on items that are not on the agenda, you can raise or lower your hand icon within the app. Then we can call on you at that moment in time. It doesn't look like anybody's ready to speak on items not on the agenda, though.
Okay, very good. We'll close public comment and then move to our first item, which is an item for consideration and potential recommendation to City Council having to do with historic resource ordinance amendments. And I'll welcome whoever the staff member is to take us away. Ms. Hernandez, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Jordan and Ordinance Committee members. I'm Nicole Hernandez, the architectural historian. I'm joined today by Assistant City Attorney John Doimes and Design Review Supervisor Irma Zueta, as well as, I believe, City Planner Renee Brook is here, as well as Rebecca Bjork and Ariel Colon. And I do think the HLC Chair Anthony Grumbine is also in attendance with a few words on the HLC recommendation. So I will get underway and present the long-awaited proposed amendments to the Historic Resources Ordinance. Next slide. Are you flipping? Nicole, can you flip the slide? There we go. The purpose of today's hearing is to consider the proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance and the map to protect historic resources and to forward a recommendation to City Council for adoption. Next slide. Just to start with some background, in 2012, the city did adopt the historic resources element of the general plan. This outlined and had several implementation actions to support updating the historic resources ordinance with up-to-date provisions and procedures and permanent protections of resources. The City Council identified making these amendments to the ordinance as one of the Planning Division's major work efforts in order to meet these goals. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through some of the major goals of updating the ordinance. One was to really streamline the process to designate historic resources. One of the efforts that's in the new ordinance is eliminating a hearing to have a resolution of intention to have a hearing. So we'll have one less hearing to designate historic resources and making noticing requirements consistent amongst all types of resources in the zoning code, and outlining the process to nominate and designate historic districts. In the current code, there's no criteria or process to designate districts. We also included a new section on enforcement and penalties for people who illegally damage or destroy historic resources. And we established a certificate of appropriateness program, which is a common historic preservation practice across the country for historic preservation programs to approve minor alterations administratively by the architectural historian. Typically, these are minor repairs to historic resources that have no visible change and meet the Secretary of Interior standards, which is our standard for review of historic resources. This is typically on projects like fulfilling cracks in stucco, or repairing historic wood windows, or repairing tile on a roof that match the original. This is an effort to help streamline the review process for projects proposing proper care and maintenance of their resources. And we are also proposing to update definitions and language to be consistent with the state and national historic preservation standards. We also propose to create consistent formatting for findings for each of the types of historic resources. and eliminate redundant sections that are already included in Title 30 in the Inland Zoning Ordinance and Title 28 in the Coastal Zone, and removing outdated ordinance provisions. Next slide. One of the biggest changes is moving the historic resources section from the environmental review and construction section of the municipal code in Title 2222 to the zoning code Title 30. This was really because of the benefit of litigation and enforcement, as zoning amendments result in shorter statutes of limitations, and property rights are encumbered not only by designation, but by enactment of zoning amendments. And I know Mr. Dimas can answer any questions on this better than I can. Next slide. So moving the amendments into the zoning code, sort of they naturally fit into the existing divisions of the zoning code that was adopted a few years ago. And I'm just going to outline the new chapters as quickly as I can. So we propose to add to the zoning code chapter 30.57, and this is where the landmark districts and historic district overlay zones will live. This is division 2 called zoning regulations, and this is where all the other zoning overlay zones live in the zoning code. This chapter will outline existing historic districts and landmark districts and their maps, and any new ones that are adopted by the council will be added to this section. Right now we have a few that are designated already that will be in this section, and that would be El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District, Brinkerhoff, Riviera Campus, and El Encanto Hotel. And I have maps of each of these districts in the optional slides if you have questions on them. We'll also have official zoning map updates to the districts, overlay zones. And we also propose to add chapter 3157 to division 3 of the zoning code called citywide regulations. This is where the historic resources chapter will go. That includes all the procedures, criteria that the city will use to regulate the designation, preservation, alteration, and demolition of resources. Next slide. The ordinance will amend chapter 3200 of the zoning code, as it will add the Historic Landmarks Commission to the list of planning authorities. And then it will amend the section 3220020 of Division 4, outlining the powers and duties of the HLC. And it will also add 30237. This is Historic District Zone Amendments, and this is the chapter that will outline the process to create a Historic District Overlay Zone. And finally, we will amend 33080 of Division 5 in general terms, adding a whole section H called Historic Resources Related Definitions. And these will keep all together as they're very specific to historic resources and the chapters that I just outlined. We will also have to amend the local coastal program. The proposal will include amending the Certified Local Coastal Program Implementation Plan by adding Chapter 28100 to Title 28, making the finding that the proposed amendments are consistent with the general plan. Coastal program and Chapter 22 and all the historic structures and all the references will be in effect in the coastal zone until the Coastal Commission does certify Title 28, at which time Chapter 22 will no longer be in effect. And we will make various edits throughout the municipal code, changing all the references. And that is detailed in attachment 3 of your council agenda report. And just as a note, 2 HLC members have already volunteered to be on a guidelines committee to help edit HLC guidelines to reflect the changes of the new ordinance and include a comprehensive document with all these sections together of the ordinance in one document as you see them in attachment 1 of your council agenda report. As another companion, we also drafted historic resource design guidelines that outline appropriate treatments of historic resources. And both those guidelines will follow the adoption of the ordinance for adoption by council as soon as possible. So updating definitions and language. We made some language changes to be consistent with the state and national preservation standards. One of the biggest is changing the name from potential historic resources list to the historic resources inventory. The state refers to their list as a inventory, and most other California communities do as well. And just to define the inventory a little for you, as the lead agency for the California Environmental Quality Act in the city, we, as most California cities, have to keep an inventory of buildings that are eligible to be designated historic resources. As CEQA requires these properties be evaluated when a project requires discretionary review. So as a result of that, all properties on the inventory are considered historic for CEQA purposes and under HLC jurisdiction. So changing the name to an inventory will remove confusion of what potential really means. I have to review that almost every day, lots of times a day with applicants. So we really think this will clear up that confusion. And then we also are changing our 11 criteria to be designated historic resource to mimic that of the National Register of Historic Places, which are 4. And we did go through an exercise at HLC, making sure all 11 criteria fit into those 4 with that. And so we wouldn't leave anything vulnerable. The HLC did request 1 additional criteria to be added, and that is that a building can qualify for being in a unique location or singular physical characteristic in a neighborhood. Next slide. So I just wanted to go over historic districts a little bit. One is the naming of a landmark district versus a historic district. Nationally, these have been used interchangeably, one or the other, but the National Register finally went and has done historic districts, and that has become the trend in the past 20 years with most communities. So we're proposing for clarity to also use the words historic district after each of ours, except for El Pueblo Viejo will have to remain landmark district, as that is its name in the charter. However, Brinkerhoff will change to historic districts, and all the new ones coming in will be historic districts. And as we look to adding historic districts, one of the big elements is that each one has contributing and non-contributing historic resources. And the contributing resources are the historic resources within it. And we are requiring 80% of those be contributing to the district or historic. This will really make sure that we have a district that has a unified entity conveying this visual sense of the overall historic environment, and it has high integrity. The whole district will be under HLC jurisdiction. So if the few buildings that don't contribute, if they are replaced with something new or have additions, the HLC will review those for compatibility. Next slide. So we also added some conditions on appeals. We added that new evidence will not be considered unless City Council determines that relevant new evidence exists and should be heard. This is really to encourage all the applicants and parties to bring all their evidence for the benefit of HLC at HLC so they can make a really educated decision rather than doing a short presentation at HLC, requesting denial, and do something more elaborate at council. And I know John Doimus will be happy to answer questions on this as well. But we really want to make sure you understand that new public comment will always be considered. This is really just on the presentation basis. Next slide. So we have a project compatibility analysis, and we wanted to make a few changes to the language. They're right now called considerations, and the commission has to go through and make these considerations and forward them on as they review a project. And we want to change that to actual findings, as a finding is a much stronger word and will carry more weight as the projects move through. And they are currently pretty much treated as findings. We just call them considerations, but it's a little confusing. And we just wanted to refine A out of project compatibility analysis to eliminate the boards from having to find the city charter and Santa Barbara Municipal Code findings, because that's really outside of their purview anyway. Next slide. So I want to just go through our 4 types of resources quickly and how they're designated, because they each have a little bit of a process, and just to make it really clear. So we'll go one all down the list. So to begin with, we have the historic resources inventory. And in the proposed amendments, the Historic Landmarks Commission, a property owner, an interested party, the architectural historian, based on permit submission or a professional survey or historic structures report that finds a building is historic and meets the criteria outlined in the code can be added to the inventory by the architectural historian. This is an effort to really streamline our process to get buildings that have historic significance and are putting in for projects reviewed as soon as possible. Right now, sometimes it takes over 60 days to get their projects reviewed because of the 60-day noticing period, and we'd want to make sure that they're reviewed by the proper board. If the building's not found significant, they go on to review, and the owner can always request a hearing in front of the HLC appealing the listing if they do not feel it meets the criteria. And this allows us to easily fulfill our obligations to CEQA. And the Historic Landmarks Commission periodically reviews the list and nominates properties for full designation or removal if they feel like it no longer meets the criteria. They have been going through them the past few years and finding that some that have been on there for 40 years no longer qualify, and some really do warrant going ahead and being designated. Next slide. So structures of merit tend to be individual buildings that are important to our streetscapes, like our bungalows and Queen Anne's, but not as individually important as a landmark. And we have 439 structures of merit designated in our city. And the process is really the HLC, the property owner, or an interested party can nominate the property, and a hearing is scheduled at HLC, and the designation is determined at HLC unless it's appealed to council. Next slide. The landmarks are the most important buildings that we have in the city. These are typically really important to the community as a whole, like churches, city hall, schools, community centers. And these have a similar process for nomination as a structure of merit. However, the hearing is scheduled at HLC just for a recommendation to City Council, and the final designation is determined by City Council. The main difference between landmarks and structures of merit, besides their importance, is landmarks cannot be demolished per our ordinance, and structures of merit can go through a EIR negative declaration and be demolished. And next slide. And then finally, we have our new historic district designation process. Because there's so many properties and property owners involved in a district, we do have some more documentation required, including a letter of petition establishing a majority of owners over 50% and support the district, a map depicting the boundaries of the proposed district, and a professional historic resources survey identifying the historic buildings and those that would not qualify. And this, again, is similar to the nomination process that HLC can nominate it, or an owner or neighborhood organization. We'd have a public hearing for a recommendation at HLC. The Planning Commission would also have a public hearing, as it does require a zoning ordinance change and ordinance map change. But the final decision, again, will be at City Council. Next slide. Standards for review. The zoning ordinance amendments must be found consistent with the city charter, general plan, local coastal program, and state and federal laws. And Planning Commission did make the finding that they did find these consistent, and City Council will have to do that as well. And the proposed ordinance and map amendments are exempt from CEQA. And next slide. One more slide. Okay, there we go. So I just wanted to go through some of the public engagement we've gone through so far for this to finally make it here to you. On April 29th, we did a presentation at a public hearing at HLC outlining all the proposed amendments. And then we posted the draft on the website on April 30th for a review period through June 7th. And on May 27th, HLC held a public hearing, took public comment, and recommended edits to the draft based on the public comment and their own concerns. We spent the summer really editing the draft. And on August 4th, we did do a presentation on the progress to City Council. Next slide. And September 16th, HLC reviewed all the edits, and we went back and reformatted the ordinance to fit into the zoning code so it would make sense with those divisions. And on November 11th, HLC reviewed the formatting changes and recommended adoption to City Council. And on December 3rd and December 17th, Planning Commission held a public hearing and reviewed the documents and made the motion to recommend to City Council approval of the amendments, along with companion guidelines to go with the ordinance. And next slide. We also have been working with the California Office of Historic Preservation on the draft, as we are a certified local government through them. So they reviewed the current draft after the Planning Commission's review and did say it appears to comply with modern best practices and support the changes as currently written. And the final slide is the recommendation in front of you today is that Ordinance Committee recommend to City Council adoption of the proposed amendments to the Santa Barbara Municipal Code and zoning map related to the Historic Resources Ordinance and amend the Certified Coastal Program Implementation Plan by adding Chapter 28100 to the Coastal Zoning Ordinance. And I do have some optional slides of some of the proposed districts that have been identified that haven't gone through the process, if you're interested in any of those as well. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Ms. Hernandez. I keep looking for Mr. Grumbine on the list. I don't see him. Ms. Crisante, do you know if he has shown up?
I have not seen him as of yet.
Okay, we can come back to him then. So how about if we open up to questions to staff? Councilmember Snedden.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. So I have a few sort of page references, questions that I just want to ask to make sure I understand things. So, and some of them are really little and some are bigger, but on page 4, starting on page 4, so I'll just go in order through the draft. There's no reference to a 30.57.030. And that's also missing on page 5. So it goes from 020 to 040. And I'm just wondering what that was, or if that's just a numbering.
And that's on the table of contents.
It's on the table of contents, and then it is in, I guess it's easier to see on page 5.
Councilmember Senn,
Yeah.
I've noticed 2 things. Yes, I think in looking at that, there are so many different drafts of this. That's probably a typo, so we'll correct that. Another one I wanted to point out too is we reference alterations as 37,300 subsection A, but it's really subsection H, but it's really subsection A. So those are two things I've seen.
I was wondering about that too. Yeah.
Yeah, there are probably 20 different drafts of this, so we will make those.
Thank you. So it's in the 2, and I think I'm sure you're so much more intimately aware with every line of this document, but I think for me, I need to go in order from top to bottom because of that. But so just there, the 030 is, I was wondering if it was a section that used to exist that was gone, and then I was wondering what it was if it was gone, but it's on page 5. Okay. So then on page 9, well, I'll go back for a second to page 7. I really tried very hard on a blank map to follow this verbal description of the districts, and I could not. I'm pretty good with maps, so I was just wondering, I just want to make, I'm sure you have, make double, triple sure that matches up, because it says everywhere in there that the verbal description overrides the map description. So it's just a sort of general statement question on that one I'm sure you've double, triple checked it. Sorry, I'm just passing by that one. That was actually more of a comment. So on page 9, there at the bottom, there's the reference to, if you could just talk about a little bit about this exception to mineral and drilling rights and slant drilling. And is this specific to the Riviera campus only, or is that in other areas in historic districts? You know?
I think it comes with their legal description. And this was adopted this way in the current ordinance, and we just kept it.
You
And
just what?
we
Sorry.
retained it because that's how it was adopted when it was adopted in the current ordinance.
Okay.
As this is how it exists now.
And
And
does
it's to the specific area too as well. So not
Okay.
other sections.
So it's just to this particular, and it's because it already had those mineral rights and that retains those rights. Okay, I just want to make sure that wasn't in other areas too. And then on page 20, if you could just describe the Kaneo Slide area. It makes reference to it being defined somewhere. But I wasn't sure that I understood where the Kaneo Slide area is, because in different, I'll just give you an example, like in having to do with, say, Kachuma water mains, they define Kaneo Slide area a certain way, or having to do with Caltrans and putting a slide up, they might define Kaneo Slide area different. It's defined kind of different ways in different places. So for this one, it says it's defined within this code.
I'm pretty sure the language is exactly what's in the existing code, and maybe Mr. Doimas can clarify, but I'm pretty sure we have to leave this in the way it was adopted in the originally when it was adopted, or Renee or Mr. Brooklyn.
Sure, committee member Snedden, Mr. Chair. So the Kaneo Slide area is defined in another section of the code, and there's also a map of the area indicating every parcel that's considered within the Kaneo Slide area. So this is, again, like Ms. Hernandez said, an existing cross-reference to it, but there is more detail found in chapter 2290 about the Kaneo Slide area.
And is that 2290, when it says of this code, that's of the coastal?
Of the municipal code. So
Of the
of the environmental policy title of the municipal code.
Okay. So it's a cross-reference there. Okay, thank you. And could you just, without me looking up, can you just tell me sort of where that is or what it is?
Sure. So it's all around the Conejo Road area. It does, somewhat bordered by Stanwood Drive, Conejo Road. The two different Conejo Roads wrap around quite a bit. And just looking at this map, I'd say it encompasses probably close to 50 parcels.
Okay. Okay, and I can look that up separately. It was just sort of a question about where it was defined.
Sure,
And-
if I may, Councilmember Sen, it's under chapter 2290, and it's basically there for construction prohibited in there. So it provides the area, the location, the parcels, where septic tanks are prohibited, why. So it's all contained in that chapter. So it's 22.90.
Okay, thank you. You're a little bit quiet to me, Mr. Doimas. I'm not sure if it's just me.
Sorry, let me know. Is this better?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay,
Thank
sorry about that. You're welcome.
And I want to say first, I was remiss. I have written in bold across all my questions to thank Nicole Hernandez, John Doimus, and Ariel Kalan for your incredible work on this. This is such a long time coming and so welcome. And I meant to say all of that first, and I mean, really long awaited and incredible work. And these are very minor questions I have. The overall ordinance is fantastic, and thank you. So then to page 21, and I think this is one of the topics Mary Louise Days wrote to us about in her email. But the minor exterior alterations, and then that reference to section H. And I guess we could skip back down to the definitions, but in section H, is it self-referential? They're the two different things that are called the same. So I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom. Section H. There's on page 42, there's 30.300.080H, and that refers to the letter of the alphabet, those definitions that start with H. But then the whole section is called 30.300.080H, and that's for all the alphabet. So that question, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so that was how it was recommended by zoning staff, so it would fit into their the existing terms and definitions. So we end up having two H's, which is confusing, and
Yeah.
I can work with maybe Mr. Cato on how to clarify that better, because what I didn't want was our definitions pulled apart. I wanted them all in one section so we could easily reference them. So that he threw them in, he was like, well, just put them under H that says historic related definitions, but now we have two H's.
Could it be 0.081 for the whole A through Z? Like 30.300.081?
I mean,
And then
I believe all of the definitions in Title 30 are 080, which is why then the letter follows. We did something very similar for coastal definitions too. So there's, as Nicole said, so that similar definitions are all found in one place rather than spread throughout the entire zoning ordinance definitions. So I think when we're seeing them here just standalone, all those related to historic resources, it's difficult to see how they would weave into the rest. But let me look at that and see if your suggestion can work. I need to look at the rest of Title 30.
yeah, no, I like that they're all together. I like that it's alphabetical and it's sort of like an index. I can go and look at the definitions. I think that's great. It's just you have two different things that are called 30.300.080H. And so if you left the main heading, and then you refer to it all throughout the ordinance, and it's probably referred to in other places too, then just changing the number A through Z for the A through Z part. Anyway, I guess my question is just to make sure that that's a legitimate, I mean, I see that as a legitimate confusing concern, and that, okay.
Agreed, right.
Something will be, okay. And then, page 31, back up to page 31. There are, and I apologize, I didn't get these questions to you ahead of time. I was still sort of reasoning them through. So on page 31F, and the exception for city facilities, and then just this part, and I know we have this elsewhere, but unless the city council deems that said review would not be in the public interest. And I'm just wondering if we have examples of what would be considered public interest anywhere, or if we could talk a little bit more about that. I've sort of seen a creep in what we consider public interest in terms of either circumventing or overriding HLC. So I have a little bit of concern about a loosely defined public interest. So it's mentioned here and in another place, and just if we could talk about that? Like, what would be the process? Would it first go to HLC and then city council would say, no, you don't need to review it because of public interest? Or would it come to city council first to decide that it is in the public interest? Like, what's the process on that?
I'd like to defer to Mr. Doimus on this one because it's more of a commission process than a historic resource.
Sure. Let me know if you can hear me. Councilmember Sneddon, it would first, as written, would go forth to the city council to decide if it was exempted. And then if it was not exempted, then it would go to the HLC to decide on the changes themselves.
And who brings it to city council in that case?
Since it's a city project or a city facility, it would be city staff that would bring it.
So if city staff wanted to deem something or in the public interest, they would have to come to council. Council would have to say, okay, that's in the public interest. And then could council say, but go to HLC for comment? Or could there, what happens after that? Yeah.
I wouldn't say would say deem it. They would give the basis or reasoning why it would be exempt, and council can make their decision on if it'd be within the public interest or what reason, what finding they would make why it would be exempt. So council has the liberty to choose a written finding on why it would not need to go to HLC. I don't know if Mr. Cullen wants to add anything else to that.
Thanks, Mr. Doimus. Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sneddon, the framework here is that the charter empowers the council, quote, in its discretion to exempt public properties. So the addition of public interest was meant to give you some guidance. There really isn't a restraint. It's meant to be a choice for council case by case in its discretion.
Thank you. And then is it clear in this document that it would come to council first and to say that it was something in the public interest? I didn't really see it in there. I just wanted to make sure that that process is clear, the order that it would go in.
I think the Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sneddon, I think the key word is unless city council deems it. So the key being that council would first decide whether or not it should be reviewed. So that's the key word that we would rely on, unless.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And then on page 32, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I do want to volunteer here, Councilmember Sneddon, that if the council's worried about the city changing its mind midway through a process and deciding that something ought to be exempt, you can give us direction to modify the ordinance to spell out that a first step in all cases would be council or HLC consideration. That's within your authority to direct us to do that.
I suppose I'm more worried about something going to HLC, it not being approved or not going well, say at HLC, and then it coming to council and saying, well, this shouldn't be at HLC anyway because it's in the public interest. So I'm concerned about that order more than I'm concerned about it coming to council first. And if that's even recommended in here, that process or.
Well, my understanding again is that it does not specify a specific time. So if you want to direct us to do that, that would be an addition that we need today.
Okay,
Meaning
so for now that's a question.
Yeah, I don't read the ordinance to preclude that determination coming at any time during the process.
Okay, thank you. And then on page 32, Planning Commission comments. And I guess this is another question about the order. And because part of the purpose of this ordinance is to streamline, I think it's worthwhile to make sure that the protocol is clear. So Planning Commission comments, so HLC would determine whether they were inviting Planning Commission comments. Is that how that would go? And then those comments are for input for deliberations for HLC. but they don't have to have findings or anything in that. Is that correct?
Council Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sutton, you are correct in terms of your interpretation of that.
Okay, thank you. And then on page 34, and this is, I think, where you referenced about, this is 34 and 35, bottom of 34 and 35, appeals. So I just want to make sure I understand. So the way it's worded here, it says, independent judgment based upon the record of the proceedings of the HLC, unless council determines that new information is to be considered. So I'm just wondering if council gets an appeal, say, are we just basing it on written record, or do we go back and watch the HLC proceedings, or how is it presented to us what the previous information was? Or do they re-present in keeping within guidelines? Yeah.
Sure. Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sutton, it kind of would mimic a court hearing in the sense that the record is all the evidence presented by the applicant, if there's anyone in opposition, whatever the HLC would review, reports from city staff, that would all be considered in one binder for you to see. So what the HLC looked at in their deliberations they're hearing. New evidence, we're giving opportunity for new evidence to be introduced on council's decision on the fairness, right? Because fairness in one sense is you want to limit the record when you review, you want to limit your decision on the record the HLC saw. For the fairness of both parties, for the fairness of the applicant, anyone appealing it, so there are no surprises when they come to council. However, if there's a reason for council to reconsider new evidence, if something came to light, something was hidden, something that could not have been produced before, but it's really important and relevant, it gives you that option and flexibility to do so. And reviewing the video is always a good idea, but it would be the written record that you would be presented with. So any of the application materials, any of the city staff reports, all those documents would be a closed universe of what you would see before you.
But there wouldn't be a presentation by the applicant.
No, of course. Excuse me. May I take this, Mr. Doimus?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, certainly there would be a presentation. The main purpose of this provision is to avoid someone, in effect, nullifying the HLC by refusing to put on evidence there in hopes of a quick route to what they might think is a council more willing to allow a demolition than the HLC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I just that was my question. Like, if there was a presentation at HLC, and then if the appeal comes to council and we have a binder but no presentation, then I'm not sure that I feel, even without new evidence, that we're getting the same quality of presentation as was presented at HLC without change. I don't know if I'm making sense on that, but that was my question on whether, so there would be a presentation still and the same, but they couldn't present new material other than what they had presented. Okay. Is that, okay, thank you.
That's correct.
And then just two more quick questions here. On page 38, so what happens if Planning Commission denies the action for a historic district overlay zone? I see what happens if they approve it, then it goes on to council within a certain number of days. But what happens if PC says no? Does someone have to appeal it then, or where does it go? Yeah.
I think it would go on appeal to city council.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would have to be there would have to be an appeal, though, an appellant and someone bringing that forward on appeal.
Right. And their review would be really the overlay map, whereas the Landmarks Commission would be looking more at all the buildings meeting the criteria and having real historic integrity, the PC needs to update the zoning map. So that's more their position.
Okay, so there wouldn't be a circumstance where staff proposes an overlay and HLC approves the overlay, and then it goes to planning commission and they say, no, we don't think there should be an overlay there.
I suppose there could be a situation that happens, but they would have to make findings for a real convincing reason why. And then I imagine after all that, it would definitely end up in an appeal, because to get to that point, a lot of effort upon the neighborhood would have gone through to get all the signatures, to have the survey done of the resources and the hearings.
Okay.
If I may too jump in, Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sutton, it's not really an appeal. The way it's, I understand because we're so familiar with using the word appeal. It's actually city council action. So it still has to go. No one has to bring it forward. It still has to go to the council for their rubber stamp on it, because any rezoning requires a council action. So if you see the language in there, it says city council action. It's automatic. It doesn't say appeal. It just says within 30 days of a decision by planning commission on the classification, there must be council must review it at their own hearing. So it automatically will go to council regardless. So it's not like someone has to bring it forth. It will go forth to city council.
So I just want to make sure. So at the bottom of page 38, D1 under decision, it says disapproval shall be based on the finding that the HD overlay zone does not establish the significance criteria for designation. And then it goes into post-approval procedures. But I guess it's not really clear to me, or maybe it should be in there. Well, what happens? I mean, if they have findings that it's not significant, then who brings that then to council? Staff brings that to council, or it automatically comes to council? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, automatically through
automatically. Okay. Okay. So, and maybe just one sentence in there saying that, since this is a document intended to sort of establish protocols and streamlining, because it wasn't clear to me, like what happens after that. Okay, and then I think we already talked about on page 39, that reference to the H section, the buffer area, but then all of those definitions together. So I guess those are my questions at this point. And I mean, really excellent document. And I think we'll have maybe just maybe a few. And and just to, one more question about referencing Mary Louise Day's email. The consistency, she has this question about the charter, section 817 of the charter, and then the consistency within this ordinance about HLC approval for minor alterations versus our historic architect.
Yes.
Is that resolved, or is that something that we need to look at?
Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sutton, it's a really good point, because the charter section 817, which stands above our municipal code in terms of order, does talk about for landmarks, and it talks about alterations requiring HLC approval. Now, minor alterations is defined as like for like changes, but the key to this is that the historian can always be appealed to the HLC, so HLC can still always review it. So we're in compliance with the charter through that. So we recognize the issue. We recognize why, in terms of streamlining, the historian would look at it, but it still gives the opportunity for HLC to review this, any decision.
I think it would be good to just, again, add a few words in there to clarify that, so that the apparent discrepancy is cleared up there. And then,
Go ahead.
and we already had the question about, well, I suppose this is a different question. Section 3.157, 110E, and again, there's this compelling public interest, but I think you've answered that with, it would be council that would decide if there was a compelling public interest, and it would have to go through that process to decide that.
Correct, and this could be, for example, usually would be most likely a health and safety issue. Let's say there was an earthquake and restoring it would be so costly or so dangerous to maintain. That's one primary example that would come to mind.
Mhm. I think that's what I was asking about before, is just what would examples of that be? That would be something like earthquake safety or a major health and safety issue, not a matter of lighting or something minor. I mean, and I think that is maybe worth, well, we can talk about that in discussion, but there are a few places where it's pretty discretionary, the public interest, and I think it'd be nice to have, like, just like you said, that example gives me an idea of scale. Oh, you're talking about like big scale public safety. Okay, then the H issue. And then if you could just, there's this sort of general question about whether this should be its own separate ordinance, or I know a lot of effort has gone into integrating it within, and if you could just comment or describe why one route over another.
Sure, if Nicole or Renee want to take that, I'm fine.
Yes, thank you, Chair Jordan and Councilmember Sneddon. We had it all as one ordinance for a long time, and the zoning staff, who really worked really hard just a few years ago to adopt the new zoning ordinance, saw it and were very, very concerned that it wasn't fitting in with the format and it would make it more confusing. And they worked really hard to help put this into the chapters, and they felt so strongly about it. And Mr. Cato came to the HLC and to the Planning Commission and did a beautiful explanation. Like, it really makes sense logistically. If you go into our zoning code, you'll find these in the correct divisions. You'll find the zoning overlays, the historic district zoning overlays, in the overlays section. You'll find the regulations in the regulations section. It's a little hard for us who are so used to having it all together to see it separate, and we will have an accessible form of it all together, as you see in attachment 1 that's attached to your report, as a handout and easily on our website if someone wants to see it all together. But as an applicant who's looking and not familiar, they're going to look in the format of the code. And when they really went through that code several years ago, they worked really hard to make it really consistent, and to throw something in there that isn't consistent, they didn't want to go backwards. And Ms. Brooke can expand on that.
Sure, Mr. Chair and committee member Sneddon, thank you. Even just stepping back to when we first embarked on this work effort, probably 6 or 7 years ago, we knew that we needed to work on this chapter of the municipal code because there was so much in it, and it had been amended over time. So it contains, in its current form, both procedural aspects of HLC, how historic resources are treated, how historic resources are designated, what are the findings for what are the triggers for HLC review. There's so much in one chapter. So in any event, just knowing we were taking on this work effort, we needed it to be divided into logical chapters, whereas ABR has its own chapter, SFDB has its own chapter. And then as we were getting into developing criteria to create historic districts, we worked closely with the city attorney's office and were convinced that that needed to live in the zoning ordinance. It ultimately will be an overlay zone. So then, okay, so that part is going to go in the zoning ordinance. And so just through all of our work on amending the different sections, it became clear that if this is all going to go into the zoning ordinance, then it should be distributed. And we were able to reduce redundancies where there were already aspects of meeting procedures that are in the zoning in Title 30 we didn't need to repeat here. And so when Nicole references Mr. Danny Cotto's presentation to Planning Commission and HLC, he really made the point that when somebody's looking to develop their property, they might think to go look to the zoning ordinance to see what are my development standards for doing something on this property. I'm going to expect there might be some height and setback requirements and parking requirements I need to comply with. And oh, look, oh, here's this whole other section of things I need to be aware of, like, oh, my property is adjacent to historic resource. What do I need to know about that? So it's helpful for the general citizen to understand all the standards that their project or their property or project is subject to. And then we do intend to create some type of resource for people whose primary interest is preservation of historic resources to help them understand the different chapters and where these ended up in Title 30. And that's what Ms. Hernandez was referencing. We have 2 members of the HLC who are really eager to work on that resource document for us. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but
It does. I suppose I have one extra question on that, and then I'm finished with the questions. But the I don't want this to be a loaded question, but does that make it somewhat vulnerable to, if you have update to zoning ordinances, now this sort of isn't set aside as its own special historic resources ordinance? I just, that's my question, I guess, about, is there a possibility that it gets lumped in with, we're overhauling all of our, updating zoning ordinances, and then in that it's like, oh, well, this is kind of messy and in the way and cumbersome, and let's just streamline this, and then it somehow morphs because it's all part of, and obviously everything needs to be consistent, but it's just a question I have about sort of the placement of it.
I know Ariel wants to answer that, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Breck. I will take the blame for insisting that the new ordinance encompass the zoning ordinance. It does a number of things that are advantageous to historic preservation. First of all, it requires 5 votes to amend. So Councilmember Snedden, by placing the historic preservation provisions in the zoning ordinance, we're really protecting them to a greater extent than they are currently. Secondly, and of greater concern, we've had tremendous change at a tremendous rate from Sacramento over the last few years. Most recently, I've been worrying about the revised version of a housing bill that was vetoed last year that would allow really dramatic subdivisions in single family neighborhoods, and maybe as many as 8 to 10 units on a single family lot. That law, SB 9, has an exemption for historic districts. So I believe that historic preservation will be ultimately pushed into kind of a health and safety box so that local government can use historic preservation as it needs to protect neighborhoods from over-densification.
Thank you, very helpful. Thanks for indulging my questions, Chair Jordan.
Thank you, Councilmember Snedden. Councilmember Gutierrez, any questions?
No, thank you. I think Councilmember Snedden asked all the questions I had. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. I'm going to use that one too a little bit. Ms. Hernandez, I really just have one topic I want to question on, and that's in regard to buffers. Thank you for the information you sent me. So I get the references of like where you sent me 3 times, and then I get the definition. But what is the purpose then of a buffer? Is it just a flag going up to indicate that greater consideration needs to happen for any adjacent development? Is that all it's doing?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. Yes, that's pretty much what it is. I can explain. It's actually in hopes to streamline our process for applicants coming through design review. If they see on our maps that, or in our planning document that their properties next to an or near a historic resource, they can start planning really early that they need to make their project compatible to that. Both ABR and HLC have to make the compatibility analysis, one of which includes the building has to be compatible with the historic resource adjacent or nearby. So if they know that early, it will only help them. What we've had in the past is often applicants paying lots of money up front to design projects. They get all the way into HLC or if they're in El Pueblo Viejo or ABR, and the commissioners can't make that finding. So we're really hoping that it'll help people really understand what's around them in their planning process to help them have a smoother design review process. And it's just a flag. We don't send notice to owners or anything, but we do let people know when they're coming in or when they're planning what's around them, and if there's a historic resource, be aware of it.
And will that type of engagement be, I'll just draw you back to however many years ago the Planning Commission was starting on this too. So I look at the Arena Adobe out my office window, and that's an Adobe building with really thick walls, right? And I just remember part of the discussion then as a real simple example is, you don't want a multi-story building to the west of it that then puts the Adobe wall in shade forever, because that starts to erode the Adobe. And to me, so I get where you're raising the flag, but we will literally just kind of leave it as it raises the flag for somebody to ask a question. You look at site-specific components and you say, okay, if you're gonna have your setbacks, that's where you want your setbacks on that place where it's getting sun right now, or you don't want it dwarfing it with 3 stories or whatever it is. Those will be part of the kinds of discussions on an applicant by applicant, location by location basis.
Correct. It is very case by case, depending on what you're next to, but we do have a section in the proposed historic resource design guidelines on how to build something compatible next to a historic resource. And that kind of includes, like, using the same verticality of windows, or some tricks with the eyes, like using the same cornice line, or, and building the density further behind so that on the streetscape, there's some continuity. I think I always think of what we're trying to prevent is, you have a row of like Queen Anne houses like you do on Bath Street, and then right in the middle of them is a sort of a 1950s cement block wall that doesn't really relate to the street anymore. Yeah. So that even though it's a new building, it can relate, and you still have this pleasant pedestrian experience.
Thank you for that. I was avoiding trying to name some from my past as examples and put the finger on them. So, yeah. All right. Thank you very much. That's the only question I have. I know Mr. Grumbine is hanging on, and we'd like to hear his comments as chair of the HLC. So, Ms. Crisante, if you could make that happen.
Hi all. Chair Jordan and other council members. Sorry, I was a little late. I had technical difficulties and some other meetings back against. Yeah, so from the HLC's perspective, obviously this is a long time coming, and as your discussions have played out, I think have been addressing a lot of the issues that we went back and forth on, and kind of got to sort of refine to a place that we felt was really a great place, and for a very good and strong ordinance that is both that has the long-term benefits of Santa Barbara in mind, including the historic nature of much of our city. So we are very happy with it, and it has been a long time coming. So we are pleased with the shape it is in, and are very encouraging for you all and for City Council to approve it and pass it. So, and if there are any particular questions, I'm happy to answer as well.
Definitely. So stay right there. Does anybody have any questions for Anthony? No, good to go. All right, thanks. And I'm happy, really happy you're happy with it, because I know it's right in your sweet spot. So I'm glad to hear that.
Great.
So I just want to do some housekeeping here. It's 1:33 and we're going to do comments and talk about some changes, I'm sure. And I want to ask staff, can we just take the pressure off and move item 2 to our next ordinance committee meeting, which I know would not be to the 9th of March, and separate these without holding up this item? Can somebody help me with that?
Councilmember Jordan, I can help you with that. Next week is March 2nd. I would push it to March 9th. We already have an 11 a.m. closed session next week. So the first opportunity would be the March 9th or March 16th meeting.
Okay, my other question was really more towards Mr. Dumois or Ms. Hernandez. And can we separate these two items without slowing this one down?
Chair Jordan, yes, we can. Absolutely.
Okay. Everybody good with that? You could shake your head yes or no. Okay, good. So let's go to comments and deliberation on this item. Ms. Sneddon, you want to go first?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. Yeah, I think just along the lines of some of my questions, very minor suggestions of what I would put in there, but I'll just make the comments here so they're in one place. So that reference to section 30.57.030. So either updating all the other numbers or something, maybe there's a reason for that, but just looking at that again of why that's missing on page 5. And then page 21, we're talking about minor exterior alterations. Just looking for consistency with the charter. So if the charter is already takes precedence, then we might as well make the language consistent within this document there. I think that would be minor. On page 22, there is, and this is also a reference to Mary Louise Day's email, there's the reference to other than landmarks, referring to demolition of historic resources, and the suggestion that you just add that other than landmarks anywhere that there's a reference to minor alterations, very small.
Can I help you up on your notes right there? I messed up and didn't, I was looking at the clock and I should have gotten to public comment. And so, yeah,
I'm sorry.
Same thing too, me too. So how about we'll get through that and then come right back to you for the rest of it. So Ms. Crisante, take us away on public comment.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. Currently, we have 3 individuals who'd like to speak on this item. First, Anna Marie Gott, then Mary Louise Days, and after that, Melissa Cunningham. Anna Marie Gott, please go ahead.
Mr. Doimus said that Ms. Day's concerned about the charter is resolved by the provision making that staff approvals appealable to the HLC. Could Mr. Doimus please direct us to the section of that draft and tell us exactly how that is going to be processed? Because we don't know what staff approvals are right now. There's no visibility to actually see any information for the public regarding staff approvals. The next one, regarding project compatibility findings, you want to make changes to that. And I'm really concerned that the ABR and HLC will now no longer actually be saying in their compatibility findings that they actually are having to follow the charter. I mean, that's their mandate. The other comment I would just have is staff is not accountable to the ABR or the HLC to present a project that does follow the municipal code before it puts anything on the agenda. We had substantially, problematic projects put in front of the ABR and HLC, and they have been missing things like sidewalks. They have not even followed the setback rules in neighborhoods. And the only stopgap measure to actually get a project revised has in many cases been the HLC or the ABR. And one of the bigger issues is anything to do with these parking lifts in a mixed use building. We had a huge project that was going to be three stories where all of the commercial parking for a medical office was going to be in a commercial, in lifts, and they were not not following any of the city's requirements regarding lifts. So that's really a problem. Regarding appeals, there is a substantial issue with appeals. My question is, are we going to have separate hearings for appeals and to make a decision on any additional information that is provided? I think that we really need to rethink some of these items, and we need to have another hearing on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Next speaker, please.
Our next speaker is Mary Louise Days. Mary Louise Days, please go ahead.
Thank you. I refer members of the Ordinance Committee to my letter dated yesterday, February 22nd. The first paragraph, I still feel that there should be at least a separate compilation of these documents made available for the public and for visitors and for property owners due to Santa Barbara's world renown in historic preservation. I appreciate Councilmember Snedden's attention to my second and third paragraphs about that the city charter has precedence over the ordinance proposal for the staff person to be able to make minor alteration approvals to designated landmarks. We strongly believe that all of these sections should be amended using the term other than designated landmarks or similar. I did not hear the city attorney say that it could be appealable. That doesn't make sense. The charter says that the HLC has authority. I do appreciate the discussion about the phrase "a compelling public interest justifies demolition," that there was an attempt to answer that and also to clarify the typographical errors in the definitions. One example, I wanted to look up the definition of redevelopment by virtue of demolition, which the only place I had to go into the full zoning to find that definition in their definitions, and that took several steps. It's so much easier just to have a handout, and there may be citizens who are willing to work, two members of the HLC, to create understandable documents for the public that still legally comply with the actual ordinance language. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Days. Next speaker, please.
Our next speaker is Melissa Cunningham. Melissa Cunningham, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair Jordan and council members and staff. On behalf of COAST and the Santa Barbara Bicycle Coalition, I have a brief comment today regarding the purview of the design review boards and particularly the Historic Landmarks Commission. I really appreciate their work in keeping our city beautiful and historic, but I feel that the design review boards, in particular the HLC, should not have the ability to deny a transportation safety project. Over and over again, they have gone outside their purview and denied projects in the Historic Landmark District that would make safe routes for pedestrians and bicycles. It is possible and seen all over the world to have bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure within historical neighborhoods. Do we have to continue to put aesthetics above human life? Are we going to let aesthetics stop us from installing infrastructure that will make it safe for children to bike to school, for essential workers to get to their jobs? Do streets and curbs really need to be subject to the same design standards as buildings? I might be late to ask this, but I would like to see additional amendments or changes made to address this problem of overstepping purview of the design review boards. The HLC cannot have the power to go outside their purview and stop an already approved, funded, and necessary active transportation project. We need to support our residents and visitors who either choose to forego or who can't afford their vehicles in favor of biking and walking. Our children especially deserve safe routes, even through historic districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Anybody else, Ms. Crisante?
Yes, our final speaker will be Roseanne Crawford. Roseanne Crawford, please go ahead. Ms. Crawford, go ahead and unmute your mic.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. Roseanne Crawford. As a member of the community, it gives me great confidence that this work has been put forth to streamline the process of, as well as protect our historic resources. They are valued by locals as well as visitors to the area. I created the MoveOn.org petition to save the historic Mission Creek Bridge out of concern for this historic bridge, as well as the corridor that includes features in the Pueblo Viejo district. The bridge studies team shows no options that our signers support in terms of protecting the integrity of the bridge and surrounding areas in this Vision Zero area. Thank you all for all your impressive work that you are doing.
Thank you, Ms. Crawford. All right. Tee that back up again, Councilmember Snedden.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. I suppose since this has been opened up by public comment a little bit, I think it's also worth asking the question of staff about the purview. This document is intended to sort of define the purview of HLC. Is that part of what this is intended to do? And that's a genuine question. Like, is that a goal of this document?
Chair Jordan, Councilmember Snedden, correct. I mean, it was already in existence under Title 22. Obviously, it's been moved now to be contained in 2 sections of the code. But the municipal code already contained language in terms of the purview of the HLC. That's also within the Charter 2 language that's contained in there as well. So it's already taking on the existing language that was originally found in Title 22 on the purview.
Thank you. So I guess I'll just say it here as comments too. I mean, this has been coming up. There's growing tension with the purview of HLC compared to the needs of transportation, solar, and again, maybe even lighting or e-bikes or any number of things that we are morphing our definitions of in the public interest and public safety. So I'm a little bit cautious about how we're defining that in the purview. And I don't think we're going to settle that here today, but I think it's something worth discussing, that this is the purview of the HLC is really clearly laid out here. And I think that's a good thing to have it had public input and gone through a process, and now it's before us. So I think that still remains a question of those definitions of in the public interest and how we interpret those, but that's, I think, for another time and not for this particular code today. So I believe I was at page 22 and reference to Mary Louise Day's comments about the other than landmarks when we're referring to demolition of historic resources, and would recommend that we just put that other than landmarks or similar everywhere that's referred to in the minor alterations or demolition. Let's see, we answered these questions about high visibility and about the process and about appeals and findings. And I believe that those are my comments of the very minor things that I think need to be addressed before this is approved. I think we so badly need this in place that I hesitate to hold it up at all with anything. I do think this reference to section H is redundant. The two different references to 2 different things called H needs to be cleared up one way or another. But I like having the definitions at the end just like that. And I think you could resolve that just with the renumbering at the end there. And I believe, I'm sorry, just wanted to, I got sort of off track there, got myself off track there. I believe those are my comments. Oh, and just the one more, I do think that there needs to be a separate document And I like the recommendation by 2 members of HLC, putting that document together and making it as self-contained, consistent with this document, but self-contained historic preservation document that's accessible to the public would be helpful. And then there was one other thing that I think I already mentioned before, but I think because my comments were in half, I can't remember, but I'll say it again if I did and I'll be done. That it's consistent with the charter. So wherever there's the language about who has purview, whether it's the historic architect for the city or whether it's HLC, that we use whatever language that the charter dictates on that. And those are my comments. And with those minor changes, really, I would recommend that this moves forward for approval. And maybe we could just see it back again when we're doing the March 9th for part 2 of this for just a quick approval, or I'm ready to approve it today with those minor changes. Thank you.
Could we make that a motion?
So moved.
Okay, thanks.
Second.
Thank you. Any comments, Councilmember Gutierrez?
No, I just want to reiterate what Councilmember Sneddon shared and say that this is definitely something I would like to push forward to the council to hear my colleagues' input and with the suggestions that she just made. And yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree too. I think Ms. Sneddon did the heavy lifting page by page. Certainly the things that resonated with me, I think going backwards to forward is which would probably be something staff would have done anyhow, and that is I call it a handout or a separate document that this is kind of going backwards from the new zoning ordinance where we worked really hard to put everything in one place. And in this particular case, we're splitting it up. So if I want to walk in and over the counter, get one document that takes care of every little nook and cranny of where we're talking about in multiple parts of the municipal code, I think there's something that speaks well to having a separate document to helping along. I know staff has made a commitment to continue to work on the Planning Commission recommendation for the tension, as we're calling it, for solar in particular. And I also certainly agree with the concerns expressed on continuing tensions on transportation issues. Everybody was trying really hard when talking about the public interest process, not to say the word bicycles, but although I agreed with the outcome of that, it was not a pretty process the way it happened to make that determination after it had already been to HLC. And I think that clearly needs to start that when a city project is going to designate something in a public interest and remove HLC, that needs to start at City Council before it goes to HLC and not give what could be the impression that we're just making an end run around HLC. I think this starts to give people much more certainty than they've had in the past, which whether you are part of the historic process or you were part of an adjacent parcel that falls within the buffers, it helps get there. And all the other reasons that Stat talked about, streamlined, moving it from one section to the other to help with enforcement and structural protection by way of an ordinance, consistency with the state and national terms, all those things and others are really, really good, and it's a great piece of work. So I just want to be clear that the motion and the second would be that staff would have listened to our comments today and also some of the public comments and bring this back for one more quicker look-see on March 9th before we take up the moved forward part of item 2 from today. Is that the way you both understood your motions? Okay. And any comment from staff? Is that acceptable?
Chair Jordan, Councilmember Sutter, no, that's perfectly fine. We have the 5 areas of change. We would like you to see those before we proceed to council. So that's all good.
Perfect. Then we have that motion and a second. And Ms. Crisante, would you do a roll call vote, please?
So moved by Councilmember Snedden, second by Mayor Pro Tem Gutierrez. Councilmember Snedden,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez,
Aye.
Chair Jordan.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I think I should ask my peers maybe to do a formal motion to move item 2 to continue that to March 9th, please.
I'll make a motion to continue item 2 to March 9th.
Second.
And Ms. Crisante, if we could also have a roll call on that.
Sorry, my mouse died. Couldn't unmute my mic. You are going to move the second item on today's agenda to March 9th. That was moved by Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez, seconded by Councilmember Snedden. Mayor Pro Tem Oscar Gutierrez.
Aye.
Councilmember Snedden.
Yes.
Chair Jordan.
Yes, thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for good work, especially staff that's been laboring on this for years and years. And we'll look forward to seeing this item back on the 9th to polish it up and send it along with a recommendation to council. And until then, we will be adjourned. Thanks.